Welcome to episode 4 of the Sensible Socialist podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about 20th century socialism, or actually existing socialism, or the not true communism argument.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care.
So, welcome to the next episode of Sensible Socialist Podcast. Hope you checked out the earlier episodes, got some good introductory materials and talking about the Communist Manifesto. I think that'll be really helpful for today's episode to kind of get a little bit of a background. But if you come into the first one, welcome, and I hope you enjoy today's podcast. What we're going to be talking about today is 20th century socialism. So that's what people think about when they think about socialism. I think they're thinking about the Soviet Union and about China and Vietnam and Cuba and some of those things. So I think it's important to discuss what those are and how those can be understood and whether or not they are examples and a good way to view or judge the ideas of socialism. And so essentially this is really about the common argument against socialism, which is that look at every time it's been tried, it hasn't worked. Or show me an example of a socialist country now. Or, socialism doesn't work, look at Venezuela. These are common arguments against socialism and communist ideas, and it's important that we don't make a straw man of them or just say like these are really weak arguments. They're not. They're things that we have to genuinely contest with. We can't deny the reality that there were some experiments that used the name socialism, used the doctrine, went to Marx, all of those things. And so the question is really, how are we going to understand those? Can we make sense of those? Are those true expressions of the ideas that we would assign, when we say communist? And if it is different, how is it different? And how do we understand it? And what's perverted about it? And all of those kinds of things. And so I think the way that it makes sense to kind of do this is to show some of the arguments against socialism that use the experience of 20th century communism to kind of frame the discussion. And so I'll play a few clips that I've found online that I think are somewhat representative of the kind of arguments that you'll hear about socialism and why it's a failed idea because of history. And then we'll use that to kind of just talk about, and I'll kind of respond to those. And hopefully that's a kind of interesting response. If you think that there are better examples of the argument against socialism or communism that I'm not properly addressing, let me know, and I'd more than happy to do like a supplemental episode or a second episode where we have a discussion about this with the best arguments that I can come with. But that being said, I really think these are not something that we can just dismiss or as some kind of like bourgeois liberal kind of argument. They're not. They're important things that we need to genuinely take into account and come to some understandings about. And so with that, I want to start off with a clip that kind of expresses a very general and vague question or position about the history of 20th century socialism and socialism in general that will help us frame this discussion. So with that, let's kick to it.
Over the past century, estimates of deaths under communism range from 85 to 100 million people.
Now I want to let the rest of this play out, but just to make this clear, I'm not going to argue that people didn't die under communist regimes. A lot of people did for a lot of different reasons. But in terms of the numbers, it's very, very difficult to know exactly how many. And the claims that are about 100 million or something like that does come from a certain book, the Black Book of Communism, and it's very highly disputed. There are things included that I wouldn't definitely include, and the real range is somewhere between 21 and 80, which is still a lot. Don't get me wrong. It's a horrific number, but it's not 100, and it is easy to exaggerate those kind of numbers, and it's likely on the actual lower amount of that scale. But just that being said, all right, let's listen to the rest of this.
To many, the collapse of the Soviet Union and increasing economic freedom in China show the failure of Marxism. Yet many remain convinced that peaceful and productive communism is possible. When asked about the Soviet Union, they may respond, but that's not real communism, believing that dictatorship was the problem, Stalin was the problem, not Marxist ideas. But communist dictatorships are not an accident. Rather, they're the natural outcome of Marxism put into practice. You, the friendly communist, might think you're nonviolent and wouldn't create an authoritarian regime if it were you in power, but if you're truly dedicated to bringing about communism no matter what, you would. Don't believe me? Let's imagine your communist revolution. Be it violent or democratic, congrats, welcome to power. It's time to organize your new classless society. The first thing you might find is not everyone is so happy you're there. Society didn't unanimously settle on your vision. So many people aren't going to give up their property to be socialized willingly. But you don't believe in their right to private property anyway, so no matter. Off to the gulag.
Okay, let's stop there for 1 second. So it doesn't matter how we get into power. Violent revolution, democratic, that apparently doesn't matter. But as soon as we do, because people won't want to give up the property, we're going to immediately institute a gulag. We're going to have concentration camps. We're not going to be able to set up a mechanism that would be able to do that in a way that would not necessitate violence. No, that's not possible because why? I don't get it.
That wealth might sustain the proletariat for a while, but eventually you're going to have to start producing new goods for the people, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. But if people don't get to keep what they make, they don't have an incentive motivating them.
Right, this is our critique of capitalism. So...
Not to worry, the new socialist man will take care of that.
Oh.
Without capitalism driving him to be greedy, his mind will be refocused to take care of all the people. Except that didn't happen in any attempt at communism ever, because man's greed might be heightened by society, but millennia of evolution have also driven a desire to collect goods for oneself.
So here we go. So the real issue here isn't that there's something really wrong with Marxist ideas. It's simply that Marxism contradicts human nature. So this turn from there's something inherently wrong with the Marxist ideas to that Marxist ideas don't represent human nature. So I guess we have to make sure that we understand exactly what human nature is and know that it's fully compatible with capitalism, because it seems like if Marxism isn't the idea, then capitalism must be.
So how do you motivate people to keep working and provide for society? Those that don't meet their quotas, off to the gulag. And those gulags better be pretty bad too if you want people to be incentivized not to end up there.
Sure, that's the only way.
And if you don't get your gulag sending decisions just right, you might end up crippling your production instead, starving millions. And if indeed conditions start to deteriorate,
probably why
you can't let the people know it's better elsewhere, or else they'll want to leave, worsening your production difficulties. So hello Iron Curtain and shooting runaways at the border.
Okay.
You don't have to have a violent evil goal to end up with evil if the demands of reality necessitate violence and evil to bring about your goal. Stop comparing the supposed evils of capitalism in reality to communism in your fantasy, and start comparing the realities of both. One has lifted billions of people out of poverty, the other has killed 100 million of them.
Oh, okay. So basically, it comes down to human nature, and there's no way to argue that human nature could possibly be any different than what it is. So I guess it's two kind of things wrapped into one. There is a whole nother argument about human nature and capitalism being like in some ways the best expression of human nature. Evolutionary psychology seems to be in some ways building itself to be a field that justifies the sort of the inherent justification of capitalism is found in our evolutionary heritage. That's not necessarily true. There's people that have different ideas about that, but that's a lot of how it is, because it's about consumer behavior and it's about a way to commoditize the information that evolutionary psychology gives us. But basically, what you're seeing here is a bait and switch to the argument about human nature. And so the very quick thing to me on that is, look, human nature is adaptability. We are able to adapt and modify our behaviors, our systems, our norms, and able to survive different changes in environmental catastrophes or ecological or economical kinds of disasters. And so I think it's fairly obvious that what we can do as human beings is change our society and reorient our behaviors and our notions and our norms and our culture to different circumstances. And I think as we automate and as we really get to post-scarcity kinds of societies and things like that, that we will be able to be more than just the kind of creatures that we are under this present system, and that we could be something different. And so that's the sort of new socialist man that is talked about with derision in that last little bit, because yeah, there is this idea that you're going to have people with a different perspective when they aren't having to work or having to do things just to get enough money to live. When that isn't the situation that most people are under, you will find people who genuinely want to do things for the betterment of everyone. And so I think that to scoff this off as some kind of like totally contrary to human nature and will never happen, blah, 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 is a cheap way of trying to actually wrestle with the ideas that we're talking about. Marxism doesn't say that you're not going to have any problems. It's not a utopian idea. They wrote a whole book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, that talks about that says, look, we're not utopians. We don't think that everything is going to be perfect. There's going to be a dialectical movement. All that the idea is behind socialism is to move beyond class struggle as the actual means of moving history. And that's the idea. The idea is that we're going to have to deal with different things, but they're going to be dealt with without the limitations of class struggle. And I think that's a very important thing to remember about what it is that we're actually trying to put in place. We're not trying to put in place some kind of authoritarian hierarchical dictatorship. What we're trying to put in place is a system that allows people to genuinely be free. And in the way to do that is not by creating unjustifiable and ridiculous hierarchies that result in a differentiation in the availability and consumption of goods, but instead to create a society where you can genuinely involve all of the people in decisions so that they can make the best decisions for themselves. That seems to me to be the society that a socialist would really want to put in place. So if you're talking about somebody whose idea of socialism is to create a gulag as the first kind of idea, well, we're not talking about the same kind of people, because that to me is not, those two things are not necessarily equatable. Have they happened in history? Yes. So let's look at another kind of way of looking at this to see if we can get a little bit closer to the actual problem that people have with 20th century socialism, because to me it's rather obvious, but they just don't seem to get it. Let's see another try.
Communists killed 70 million people in China, more than 20 million people in the Soviet Union, not including about 5 million Ukrainians, and almost 1 out of every 3 Cambodians. And communists enslaved entire nations in Russia, Vietnam, China, Eastern Europe, North Korea, Cuba, and much of Central Asia. They ruined the lives of well over 1 billion people.
All right, so look, this is how I would think about this. When you have Marx and Engels writing the Communist Manifesto, it's in the 1840s, almost 1850s. The first example of what even Marx said would be something that you could maybe call socialist is the Paris Commune. That's 1871. It doesn't last for very long. But you have a system where you got genuine election of people who are representing you. You have no restrictions on who could actually be a part of it, and a way that is a genuine kind of democracy. And the conditions at which it happened in Paris were horrible. The city was under siege. The country had been at war. It was under a new monarchy. I mean, these are bad conditions to be able to move beyond the new mode of production. I mean, it's in an emotive disaster. And I mean, the disaster, I think, was caused in some ways by the competition between 2 emerging capitalist powers, France and Germany. But Prussia. But the underlying conditions in which it would be able to build a system that would have long-term success is not the kind of conditions that they had in France. But still, they had the right motivation and attempted to do it, and were eventually slaughtered. So one lesson that a lot of communists had learned after the Paris Commune is you have to protect yourself, and you have to protect yourself in a way that is commensurate with how you will be treated. And how they were treated was lined up against a wall and shot. So you had the building of a new kind of socialist ideas, too, of taking power through democratic elections, and you had movements to do that in Germany and in many places. You also had, and Germany was really developing its capitalist structure. France was, England and the United States especially, and Japan. I mean, these are countries that are building up a new industrial system. And there were places that were in some ways like the hinterland and still having yet even gotten rid of their genuine feudal monarchies like Russia. And so, not to mention something like China. And you had colonies like Cuba and much of South America, frankly. And so you had areas where capitalism was more developed than other places. And there was a colonization happening of those places to extract resources and cheap labor in order to maintain the capitalist system as described in the Communist Manifesto. So what you had, I think described by Marx and Engels in the Manifesto, was this idea that you were going to have the most advanced capitalist countries go through the kinds of crises and produce the kind of working class that is educated, understanding, can actually take control of the mode of production and use it for the benefit of the majority. So the places that you're looking at for that to happen are the United States, England, Germany, France, maybe Italy, things like that. The places where capitalism had started and developed. Europe, Western Europe, frankly. But the ideas had spread all over the world, the ideas that Marx was talking about, because there was something even more fundamental that he was talking about, because the history of class struggle is a genuine history. And so even in places where there were feudal forms of oppression, the notion of speaking about a resistance to and a revolution against those kinds of forces that would create a society in which there were no more classes spoke to people, even non-industrial working class people. And so in places like Russia and China and Vietnam and Cuba, these ideas spoke to the oppressed people, and they still speak to oppressed people everywhere. And what happened was, when the war happened in 1914, you had a split in the Second International Communist Organization that was deciding whether or not you were going to go into the war or not. And there were those that were opposed to going into the war because it was an imperialist war between imperialist powers, and workers in different countries shouldn't kill each other. And you had those who decided that they were going to go in and that they were going to support their country in the war. And it was through the course of the war that there was another creation of conditions, not very good conditions for an actual successful long-term project at rebuilding a deformed capitalist society into a new socialist society, but where the oppression was so deep and so systematic and so powerful that the notions about the resistance against it and the ability to build that new world were also so powerful that they took over. And you have a revolution, a few subsequent revolutions in 1905 and then two in 1917 in Russia. Now, in Russia, you're talking about a society that barely is out of feudalism. It is not Germany or France in the sense of its industrial development. It has some industrial development. It has a navy. It has all those kind of things. But it is not an industrial powerhouse. It is a majority peasant society with a czar that is both head of the government, head of the military, and head of the church. And so you're talking about a society that is not prepared to have an industrial working class that is advanced in understanding and technologically ripe to be able to really take the reins of power and put it into place. So at the same time, you have a revolutionary environment in that czarist dictatorship that necessitated a small group of radical revolutionaries who would be able to orchestrate the right kinds of things in order to bring about what amounted to a coup. That is, in the conditions of a war, the government is neither prosecuting a war that ought to be prosecuted or prosecuting it well, and that there is a revolutionary current in society to topple that regime and replace it with something else. And that was the conditions at which the Bolsheviks really took power. Now, it's a massive oversimplification, but I think that that is ultimately the right way to look at it. And so the way that you're taking power, even if it is in the interest of the working class, which I think it genuinely was, you didn't have the kind of advanced industrial working class that would be able to really take it. And so what you had to do was build that. And I think even the early notions of the Russians at the time were to say, look, let's build a system, or let's have a revolution that can spread to the other parts of the world so that when they revolt, we'll be able to help them and they'll help us. And so there was this notion that they were not going to have to do it alone. And they had a revolution. They were attempting to build something that would be able to assist. They were involved in a civil war, and it degenerated very quickly into a wartime dictatorship, which, like in the Paris Commune, is the exact opposite conditions you want to genuinely build a revolutionary socialist society. So they were going against all odds, and I commend them for what they were able to build, because the socialist project, I think the person that talks about this best is Milovan Žilas, and he says, look, what happened was the ideas of communism ended up creating a new class society, and in which there was a privileged class of bureaucrats and overseers who were able to use their position to leverage the economy in ways that did ultimately help people, but in a very inefficient and non-egalitarian manner. And that created the conditions by which there's actually a new class society developed in this deformed kind of quote-unquote communist state. It doesn't represent the communism that Marx talked about, but it represented a way in which a country could rapidly industrialize, taking countries that are not industrialized, Russia, China, Cuba, all these places, and finding a means to rapidly industrialize. And they did so. And there's massive successes in terms of the achievements that rapid industrialization was able to achieve in Russia, in China. There's a lot of talk, and it's genuinely okay to talk about how many people were killed in the course of constructing those kinds of things. But no discussion is often held of how many people were saved in the construction of those, who had died in the regimes that had previously existed, and all of those people who do die under the capitalist mode of production from starvation and war that is completely unnecessary in a society and in a system that could be post-scarcity for almost everything. So the discussion of 20th century socialism has to be understood in the idea that you're talking about constructing a system that is supposed to be in the advanced societies that is being constructed in some of the not advanced societies that are still yet to have a bourgeois revolution, much less a socialist revolution. And there is this whole notion of that being stagist and not understanding that you don't have to necessarily go through each step in a certain sequential order. And I think there's some truth to that. But you at least have to develop somewhat of a modern capitalist economy if you're ever going to have the industrial working class that's going to take it over. And if you look at the society that we've created now, you're talking about a very advanced working class that doesn't even want to see itself as working class because we're doing so much intellectual labor. But we're training ourselves to be able to construct a system that is going to be able to give us both leisure and worthwhile projects that are going to be able to genuinely increase the utility and enjoyability of life. And I think that if you look at what conditions societies that called themselves communists, from Russia and Vietnam and Ethiopia to Yugoslavia, I mean, all of those places, you're not talking about the conditions best ripe to create it. And so given those restrictions, it seems to me fair that a discussion of the not real communism is a genuine contradiction of the notion that this is somehow an inevitable conclusion of Marxist ideas. These are quite obviously deformed versions of the power of the ideas in the wrong situation. And in some ways it verifies Marx. It says, look, you have to have the right material conditions, and you can't just will something into existence. You have to create the conditions where it's genuinely ripe to make the society that we're talking about. And I think very personally that the society and the places that are most ripe for the conditions, to bring about the conditions of the place that we want to live, is Western, not even Western, our countries around the world. So many countries, even China, and if we all did it together, we would be able to achieve a lot. And that doesn't necessitate war or conquest. That necessitates a change of leadership in a few different countries, namely the United States of America, that would be able to reorient the position of powerful countries, not towards denying the revolutionary struggles of others, which it has for the entirety of the 20th century. Remember, the United States and 17 other countries invaded Russia right after its revolution, and every other revolution in country had an invasion of some sort of another. This kind of organization of international socialism or communism would be one that is uniting the most powerful countries and genuinely helping other countries to be able to build the right conditions, to be able to have a educated and advanced industrial working class, to be able to take it over and end the class struggle. So I think the notions that these are absolutely necessary conditions or results of Marxist ideology is just a flat misunderstanding of what that really means. Okay, so that's pretty long-winded, but let's listen to another criticism of what we're talking about.
When I was growing up in South America in the 1970s, Venezuela was the country that people emigrated to get away from poverty and oppression. How quickly the application of socialism can turn a prosperous, functioning modern economy into a disaster zone. 800% inflation, running out of food and basic medicines. Incredibly documented cases of malnutrition. All the way through the Chavist experiment, we had voices on the left in this House and in the national governments cheering it on and saying that it should be a model for our European governments. And now, suddenly, it wasn't socialism at all. It was a sort of experiment that went wrong, like all of the others, like Yugoslavia, like Romania, like Cuba, China, Russia. It's always wonderful until it goes wrong, and then it was never proper socialism in the first place. Invariably the same pattern. And the displacement activity we just heard, that is, something else is happening bad in Honduras, and therefore we shouldn't care at all. The reality is it was perfect textbook socialism, control of an economy that reduced a once wealthy country to poverty and dirt. When are we going to learn the lesson?
Yeah, all right, muted applause. So let's talk about Venezuela for a second. Venezuela, despite what you heard there, is not a textbook example of socialism. And if a textbook example of socialism is that which crashes an economy, then capitalism is socialism? But I don't get it. So, look, Venezuela under Chavez came to power through an election, so not a violent revolution, did try a coup, got in jail, got released, got elected. What they did was not give industries over to the workers. They didn't do that anywhere. Look, when you're talking about socialism, a government comes into power that is socialist in nature in order to transfer ownership of the means of production from the individuals who own it to the workers. Now, it does that by transferring it to the government by some legal mechanism, and then the government gives it to the workers. That's how it could be. Now, you could have a direct transfer. I'm not necessarily in favor of a government transfer, government ownership of the means of production. But the government ownership of the means of production is not the end goal of this system. It is the transitionary period. It is the way to transfer it from individuals to the workers. If you want to have a legalistic way of doing that, a government needs to come into power, because a government can do whatever it wants. Frankly, let's be honest. A political scientist, the government has the ability to do what it wants. Now, there's legal norms and all sorts of things that constrict it in terms of what it can and actually do in terms of it expressing its own people. But in principle, a government has the ability to set up the system that it wants. Because especially if it's given mass legitimacy by some kind of voting mechanism or something like that, it's a government that has legitimate sovereignty. So, in Venezuela, what you have is not a government that is giving the means of production to the workers. You have a government that is nationalizing industries, making it government-owned, and then using the nationalization, using the profits generated to both create a system of privileged people and to give people who are poor and desperate something more. It's a development model. It's exactly like what I was saying. This communist rhetoric is used in places that does not have a genuinely advanced modern working class to be able to take over the means of production, that you can use communist ideas to make sure that life isn't so terrible for the people there. And it's a very good idea for motivating people to fight for justice, equality, freedom, and all of the ideas that are wrapped up in socialism, that are the good ideas that people have always gravitated to socialism because of. But that being said, there is no notion where the workers were controlling the economy of Venezuela. It was an economy that was a welfare state, that was using the profits it was able to generate from its grand national and natural resources, and using them to fund projects, the barrio missions, that were able to help a unreasonably impoverished group of people in a very modern economy in terms of its ability to create wealth, but not a modern economy in terms of its creation of a genuinely advanced working class that could take power. And it's a very important tactic of neoliberal capitalism, which is the kind of thing that Chavez talked about and really wanted to fight against. And so I don't think that when you look at Venezuela, you're talking about the imposition of genuine socialism, but what you have is the imposition of a welfare state. And yeah, welfare states don't ultimately work. When you're not having genuine participation in the economy by most people, and you don't have the transfer of ownership into the hands of the workers, you're going to have a system that ultimately fails. Now you add to that the subjection of economic warfare and the destruction of the basis of the creation of the wealth that you are redistributing, i.e. oil in Venezuela, especially because of the shale oil in the United States and in Canada that dropped the oil price, which is another thing that happened to Russia. You have a significant inability to maintain the system that you thought was going to create if the price of oil maintained its high level. And so through chance, economic factors, and a structurally unfit system, a welfare state without a genuine transfer of the ownership and control of the means of production to the working class, you're going to have a system that ultimately fails. And so I think that if you're going to talk about Venezuela as some kind of example of socialism gone awry, you don't fundamentally understand what happened in Venezuela, and you don't understand what socialism is. And so given those two misunderstandings, it's no doubt that you would think that Venezuela is some kind of perfect example of socialism, when in fact, it's the exact opposite. All right, here's another.
Still hear people today, many people, when they're faced with the, if they're Marxist in their orientation and they're faced with the data pertaining to what happened in the Soviet Union, they'll say something like, well, that wasn't real Marxism. But one of the things that you might answer to that is, well, fine, except that in every bloody country in the world where that doctrine was implemented, regardless of the wide cultural differences between the cultures, say the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, and so forth, exactly the same thing happened every time. And we still have a great example of that today in the form of North Korea. I don't know if you've ever looked at a map of the world at night. You can get a map of the entire globe at night. You look at South Korea, it's lit up like jewels. It's nothing but light, like the east coast of the United States and Canada. And North Korea is dark. And the reason for that is that 50, 60 years of barbaric, communist, despotic rule means a country that's completely unindustrialized, where every single person is malnourished or starving to death, where everyone lives in terror all the time, and where there's nothing but the continual production of labor in labor camps, just like in the Soviet Union and Maoist China. So if we were willing to pay attention, we could still see examples of that today, and that's not an anomaly. North Korea is exactly what you'd expect given the doctrines upon which it's founded.
North Korea is exactly what you expect, given the doctrines on which it's founded. I would wonder what Jordan Peterson would say is the doctrine that North Korea is founded on. Would he say it's Marxism and communism? I don't believe the North Korean government even would say that their government is really based on Marxism, communism. I'm guessing they would say maybe it's something influenced by it, but it's a Juche ideology, not necessarily Marxism or communism or whatever you'd want to say. So I don't know what you're talking about, Jordan. The whole way in which Jordan Peterson in particular talks about this, I think, is really dangerous and problematic, frankly. Look, he deals a lot with Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago, and there is not a person who should be listened to who would defend the use of a Gulag system. If you have to use a Gulag system, your system is somehow unjustifiable. It doesn't have a reason to be, and it doesn't have any justifiability. I think that is a disqualification, and I think I can say that as a socialist. And so the idea that is, just like in that first clip, somehow this inevitable result of the idea is just not ever made clear. Why is that something that has to happen? I don't see how this is a murderous ideology necessarily. All we want to do is have workers own their businesses and be able to participate in a democratic society that isn't controlled and owned by other people for no good reason. I don't understand why this necessarily is some kind of dangerous, murderous ideology. When you look at where these have happened, when you say, look, that's not real Marxism. Yeah, it's not real Marxism. You're not talking about the revolution happening in the most advanced societies in the world. You're talking about it happening in some of the most economically backwards. And so, yes, you're going to have these massive deformations of the kinds of systems that kind of revolution in that kind of situation produces. The violent revolutions that brought out bourgeois society or brought out liberal democracy in the world were also violent and pretty terrible. The class struggle that produces the kinds of systems that we live in is not a clean business. It's very messy. And that doesn't justify it. It simply makes it clear that this isn't something uniquely problematic with the ideas of socialism. It's about when and how these ideas interact with the material conditions such that they create certain kinds of situations that are not ideal. And they're not ideal. They're not good. But they also aren't all bad. And the point is that if it's used as a model of industrialization, it can be very effective with very high costs. And those high costs don't justify the developments. But the number of lives in the shorter period of time is equivalent or equatable to the number of lives lost in the larger period of time in the development of modern life in Western Europe and other places. And that doesn't even really take into full account the number of people enslaved and oppressed in ways that were horrible or died in massive, massive wars. And so given that, the idea that this is just like the worst kind of genocidal inherent ideology doesn't really make sense to me. It's fairly clear that if you even understand the basic notions of Marxism, that the society that Marx would see as communist is not the society that was put together through war and conflict, constant war and conflict, by the Soviets in the 30s and 40s or 50s. I mean, it wasn't that kind of society. The society would be something much more akin to a highly advanced, technologically utilized system where people are able to, like Marx said, fish in the morning, do some work in the afternoon, and then criticize plays or other people's artwork at night. Something that genuinely allows people to have full development. And if you're looking at North Korea or the Soviet Union, you're not talking about systems that are genuinely able to do that. If you were able to put into place a society democratically owned and controlled, that's a society where you're going to get genuine freedom and genuine understanding. So let's check out another clip and see what we can do.
Oh, that's the phenomena of the West. You know, that's what people in our countries are going through, is alienation. It's talked about, like, one of the things that another guest taught me about Marxism, that Marxist theory, the way that he criticised and broke down capitalism, how it operates, he wasn't just talking about the economics, although Marx was a great economist. He goes, capitalism will lead to individuals feeling worthless and meaningless because they'll just be cogs in a machine. It will break people's spirits. And that is what's happened. Because
but it's still not the only thing that's happened.
Go on.
It's also created incredible technology,
Definitely.
medical innovation, all sorts of different ways that we can make the world easier.
Do you think we could keep those things without the cheese grater soulmate? Because I think we could.
I think we could.
We've got the stuff now. We could progress with it. We could have different, fairer ways of doing that. And people, I think people sort of kill that conversation too early because there's, because it's working for enough people.
Yeah, they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
I think so.
Yeah, that's what the whole thing of Marxism is the abandonment of capitalism. And so let's go this way. But, you look at what happened when people adopted Marxism. It led to the death of millions and millions of people.
Yeah.
As has capitalism in a lot of places.
Well, more deaths, but it's not reported in the same way. But I'm not saying that we all want to live in communist, or the Soviet Union or China. Terrible, terrible things happen there. But that's what we always revert to. We say, well, is it not possible that we could? For a start, they didn't do it properly. They ignored it.
That's what everybody says, but no one's ever done it properly. I mean, we have more freedom today. Human beings have more freedom to behave, more freedom to communicate, more freedom to excel with this capitalist society that we're criticizing today than any human beings that have ever lived ever. There's a lot of negative about it, 100%, but it's also, there's a lot of benefits and positive about it. There are a lot of soulless people that are just counting numbers and throwing them on a hard drive somewhere and buying yachts. That's true too.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to evolve and aspire.
Right.
I don't think evolution is finished. I know there's loads of good things about capitalism, but I think let's carry on. Let's see what we can do. Could we be doing this better? I believe that we could. I believe that this has taken us about as far as it could go because of certain ecological imperatives and the spiritual thing that you deftly mentioned, that it's destroying the souls of a lot of people, and it's not necessary. When is that? What we were promised in the 50s, and the technological revolution will mean you'll work half an hour a day. No one delivered on that. People just went, oh, actually, you carry on fucking working, and we'll siphon the profit uphill. We could have leisure-based societies, but I think that as long as there is a form of centralized power, people at the center of that power will not share it. I think you have to go, all right, this community is going to be run by those people, this community is going to be run by those people, and that also solves a lot of the other problems that are defining our times. Of people seem to want different things. Some people want to say absolutely no homosexuality. Some people say we want total sexual freedom. Some people we want to live in what would be called a religious extreme way. Some people say atheist. Well, that can't exist under one banner.
Yeah, so I would really wonder who would take fault with what that just is right there, because there's an honesty that both of them had in terms of the genuine understanding that yes, there have been significant problems and unjustifiable actions taken that have cost the lives of lots of people, and that's a genuine statement that I think is honorable to make and true. It's dishonorable to deny that. At the same time, what Russell Brand said in that clip was, I think, exactly right, that a lot of people will make the claim, look at all the people who have died, and look at all the people who have been benefited. Look at all the people who have gotten out of poverty, dubious ways of judging who gets out of poverty. But aside, yeah, there must be an acknowledgement that capitalism has done a lot of good things for a lot of people, and has done a lot of good things for a lot of bad people. It's done a lot of good. But like Russell said in that clip, it's not going to be able to do what it's done forever. And the utility of what it has been able to create is getting to a point where it's no longer useful. Ecological imperatives, economic imperatives, frankly. And when you're talking about new situations where you have significant amounts of people alienated, depressed, killing themselves at ungodly rates that you don't see in a society that genuinely gives people a reason to live. And we have serious crises of culture in many ways, these decadent capitalist kinds of systems. And so it seems fairly obvious that, yes, we've done quite a bit under these conditions, but there's also a lot to do. There's a lot that we could do that's a lot better than the kind of system that we're creating. And there's notions of like universal basic income and ways that you're going to have to deal with the sort of combating of the technological advancements in automation and that kind of stuff, and the already existing economic crises that happen. But the thing is, if you don't genuinely talk about how we structure our system and how we make the decisions and who gets what, if we're just handing out money to people, we're not genuinely changing anything. We're not changing the material conditions of the society. We are letting it steamroll over our ability to progress into something genuinely amazing. And so, just as a way of being frustrated about how we can't really progress and how there seems to be such a slowing of any kind of genuine progress of human flourishing, that, you know, you have Facebook and it seems like this great thing to connect with people, but it makes people depressed and sad. You have all of these ways that people are distracted and discouraged from, and not even able to participate in the things they want to do in the ways that they want to do it, that you are not using and harnessing the energy and intelligence and beauty of other people. You're constraining it for no good reason. And while a few are able to genuinely and insanely benefit from the system that creates this massive amount of wealth, the rest of us just don't seem to be getting much. And if we could just harness our intelligence and care about our society and other people, the society that we would create by using that energy would be a society that didn't have opioid addiction problems and mental health crises and racism and all of these kinds of things. That it would be a society where we could work at our differences and understand each other's problems in a way that would genuinely thrust us into a kind of solidarity that made us new people and would be the kind of society that you'd want to live in. And it isn't utopian. It isn't to say that it's just going to happen with a snap of your finger, but it's a system that genuinely allows us to do that. And so why wouldn't we put it together? So it just seems to me that there's no fault that you can take with what they were talking about there. And any kind of notion that, you know, oh, it hasn't worked before, so it'll never work again, doesn't understand why it didn't work before and how it could work again. So before I start this next one, I just want you guys to take a second and listen to the emotive way in which he really talks about this stuff, but understand how much emotional content there is in there, how little actual intellectual content there is.
And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine. You don't understand it. You don't understand it. And you're not that good. And if the power was in your hands, assuming you had the competence, which you don't, you wouldn't have done any better. And even if you had, there would have been someone else waiting right behind you to shoot you the first time you actually tried to do anything good. And that's what happened to all the old guard who ran the damn revolution. Stalin rounded them all up and shot them, along with their families and millions of other people. So even if you do happen to be that avatar of moral purity that you claim implicitly, the probability that you'd get to act out your goodness in relationship to those possessed by your ideology is zero.
All right, so there's a lot of "you would necessarily" here, and there's no way to stop against it, and there's a bullet no matter where you go. Where does he get this stuff? I mean, seriously, it really it bothers me because there's a huge amount of people who really like Jordan Peterson, and there's some things that I like about Jordan Peterson, frankly, but this whole discussion of his vile and ridiculous ways of talking about this, just no one's checking it, and somebody should. Look, if you were in Stalin's position at the time, you might make the same choice as he did, because you don't just get to make different choices in the circumstances at which you find yourself in those kinds of positions. Material circumstances matter. If you don't understand what brought people to the situation that they were in the time, you don't in any way understand their decisions. And if you try to psychoanalyze them without taking into consideration the conditions that they're in, the conditions, the ideas that you're going to come to, the conclusions that you're going to draw are totally wrong. They can't possibly be what's actually going on because you don't understand what the frickin' person was in. Like, you don't see the person for who they are. And so you totally misjudge them. And if you think that then you can use that misjudgment to place blame on the ideas that you think motivated them purely, and don't take into consideration any of the other things, you definitely misunderstand what the hell's going on. And Jordan Peterson's whole understanding, quote unquote, of Marxism via Solzhenitsyn is just wrong. It doesn't make any sense. And I would be happy to talk to him and try to figure out where it is that he's drawing these conclusions, because he makes a lot of inferences and assumptions about human behavior in relationship to certain ideas that he thinks are absolute and inviolable, that it doesn't make any sense unless you see it from his particular point of view. And he will be able to tell you that from his point of view being correct, you will act in a certain situation given X situation. I think it's wrong. It doesn't make any sense. And he doesn't explain it very well. And so it's a lot of derision without a lot of content. And so it makes me want to cry, but it doesn't make me think any differently. Now, say what you will about Slavoj Žižek, but in terms of an answer about how to think about 20th century socialism, I don't think this is a very bad answer.
In your view, was or was not communism a catastrophic failure?
Total failure.
Total failure. So why do you still call yourself a communist?
Because what I think is that communism was an answer to a series of problems. It looked throughout 1990s, for a decade, we had what I ironically refer to as the Fukuyama dream. We were all
Francis Fukuyama. We've reached the end of history.
Yes. He was not as stupid, as naive as he is somewhat sometimes portrayed. Yes, he's not saying, "Oh, it's the end." He knows things are still moving. Sure. But his idea is just that with liberal democratic capitalism, we found, if not the best possible, at least the least bad system.
He suggested that here was a global consensus, and that it would gather in people across the world.
My thesis is, what we witness in the new century is the gradual disintegration of this consensus. For me, wouldn't you agree that even the majority of leftists today, they are let's call them ironically, Fukuyama leftists? Because nobody even talks today, about these old big questions. Is capitalism here to stay? Is democracy, is the state here to stay? In the same way that when I was young, at least, we were dreaming about, remember, socialism with a human face. Now, it is as if our utmost horizon is global capitalism with a human face. So and here we come to a point, the only serious question that I see today is precisely this one. Is, in the broadest terms, the liberal democratic capitalist framework the absolute horizon so that we can make it better, more tolerant, better welfare, but we stay? Or are there phenomena for which it is reasonable to surmise that even in the long or even in the midterm, it will not be possible to resolve them or even to cope with them within this frame? I think there are.
And that's kind of what I'm trying to say. That I think that there are a lot of things that we would want to not wholly get rid of in terms of the society that we would want to create if we were even to call it socialist. Ideas of human rights, not violating them like they were violated in other systems that called themselves socialist, would be a mainstay of what we wanted to do. Not being belligerent and aggressive militarily when it wasn't necessary and when someone was looking for independence. Genuinely giving people the ability to decide for themselves how their societies were going to be. Those ideas would be the ideas that would be motivating a genuine new communistic movement. And I think that you can make the claim that that is something that is a genuine notion and that you could justify, because the way that we are going to interpret that word and use that word in this next century is going to be the way in which it is designed to be used, as a way that we understand that we're taking back the means of production and control away from individual people for their own private benefit and putting it into the hands of the community in a way that they were able to make decisions on a principled basis, using the notion of human rights and understanding in order to make the productive system work to satisfy the needs of people. And once the needs are satisfied, which wouldn't be difficult, the ability to direct economic work towards advancing our cultures and societies and individuals is the goal of a socialist future. We are talking about a system that isn't fettered by capitalist restraints and isn't destroyed by authoritarian results of imprudent times and bad luck and bad decision making. I think that you can see where and why the socialist project of the 20th century went wrong by understanding what socialism really is. And it isn't a psychoanalytical problem of class jealousy and of bigotry and misunderstanding of human nature, or the notion of the destruction of individuality, or any of the kind of things that you hear about the inherent problems with socialism. What we're really talking about is a society that's free, a society that's democratic, and a society that genuinely works in the interest of all people. This isn't difficult. It isn't honestly rocket science. And you can get very detailed analyses of why capitalism goes through these crises and what the crises really mean and what the costs of the crisis are in human lives and human civilization. You can do all that, and it's definitely possible, but you don't really need to. What you need to do is understand that examples of what called itself communist or socialist in the past may not and have not been very close to what, let's say, Marx himself would call anything like socialist or communist. And so words do matter, but words don't mean everything. Context means everything. Historical understanding means everything. And the ability to genuinely understand the conditions that people lived in, the ideas that they used to motivate themselves, and how those are true to the bases of what they are saying matters a lot. It really is important to take into account that if someone calls themselves a Marxist, they may not know what Marxism means. And if they call themselves a socialist, they may not know what socialism means. They may have an idea, but they may not be able to define it. And so, if you're going to make judgments about what socialism is or what socialism means, you should understand what it really meant when it was first used. Because to say that the Soviet Union is an example of socialism is to misunderstand socialism. To say that the People's Republic of China is a communist system is to not understand communism. To criticize Marx by talking about Venezuela's inflation means that you don't understand Venezuela or Marx. it's a very important thing that we use concepts and words correctly if we're going to really talk about what we can do to make our societies better. And I think the inability to understand what happened in the 20th century and what went wrong, which is that it wasn't the right place at the right time and the right conditions. And based on that, some really bad decisions were made and things didn't happen, that we are where we are. And we are seeing the full expression of a late stage capitalism that in many ways probably should have died many years ago, but didn't. And so here we are. And to make claims about the inevitability of a Stalinist future with anything looking like communist or talking like communist isn't really fair, and is a misappreciation of the value of those ideas and what really did motivate all the people who said that they were trying to bring about a socialist future. If we're looking at the kind of society that we live in and how far away we are from those kinds of systems and those kinds of backwards economies and undeveloped areas, we really see the full expression of what Marx talked about in the manifesto. A real worldwide system of capitalism, integrated, neoliberal, colonized, late stage, finance-based. We're really seeing the time when the end is near. And if we don't understand what we can do and how we really are the modern, technologically advanced, and educated working class that can really run the society in a way that's going to benefit people, we're never going to show ourselves to be exactly what we are, which is that group that's capable of running the society for the benefit of everybody. So that would be the way that I would see the 20th century in a quick nutshell. I don't want to talk for more than an hour. I think that'll get boring. But if you have comments or questions or disagreements, let me know. Send me an email. Find me on social media. I would love to hear from you. So you can find our contact info and stuff on the website. And if you want to talk about this or other issues, I'd be happy to talk to you. But on that, I think I'll leave it to you. And see you next week. We're going to be talking about American socialism. So the history of socialism in America. I think that it's a long forgotten thing for a lot of people, and it's important for everyone, but especially young people, to know about. But until next time, see you later, and check out sensiblesocialist.com.
Growing up in the bottom of it all, told you were insignificant and small. Everyone trying to put you in your place based on your gender, class, and race. It's a choice you did not choose, but it's one you cannot lose. They got the numbers, we got the power, so fight for what matters. You're not alone. You gotta know. 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 You gotta know. You fought for something that you thought was real, but being offended wasn't part of the deal. Tuning into another feel-good speech when all they do is preach and preach and preach. The war funding has just increased. It doesn't sound like noble peace. We've got the numbers, we've got the power. Let's fight for what matters.